What happens when the most classified person in America decides to take a commercial flight? When someone so secret that even mentioning their name requires security clearance sits in seat 12F next to ordinary travelers who have no idea they're inches away from the person who could change the course of history with a single phone call. This is the true story of how a routine Tuesday morning flight from Denver to Washington, D.C. became the most protected airspace in the country, how two F-22 Raptor pilots nearly broke protocol when they heard a name that made their blood run cold, and how 180 innocent passengers became unwitting participants in one of the most tense hours in recent military history. The woman in seat 12F looked like any other business traveler. She had a simple black carry-on, a cup of coffee, and was reading what appeared to be a routine financial report. But that report contained intelligence that could prevent or start the next global conflict. And the woman reading it was someone the Pentagon had spent decades keeping hidden from the world. This is her story. This is their story. This is what really happened at 35,000 feet when the ordinary world collided with the extraordinary secrets that keep nations safe. Sarah Chen had been flying commercial airlines for 3 decades, but today felt different. As a senior flight attendant for United Airlines, she prided herself on reading passengers the moment they stepped aboard Flight 1247. The businessman in 3A was nervous about a presentation. The young mother in 8C was traveling alone with twins for the first time. The college student in 15B was heading home after a semester abroad. But the woman in seat 12F was impossible to read. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing an unremarkable navy blazer. Nothing about her suggested she was anyone special. She had boarded without fuss, stowed her single black carry-on efficiently, and settled into her window seat with the practiced ease of someone who flew frequently. She declined the pre-flight beverage service with a polite smile and immediately opened what looked like a standard business portfolio. What Sarah couldn't shake was the way the woman's eyes had briefly scanned the cabin as she'd walked to her seat. It wasn't the casual glance of someone looking for familiar faces or checking out fellow passengers. It was methodical, professional, and lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sarah had seen that look before, years ago, when her brother had returned from his deployment in Afghanistan. It was the look of someone trained to assess threats. The flight from Denver International Airport to Ronald Reagan Washington National was scheduled to take just under 4 hours. As Flight 1247 taxied toward the runway, Captain Michael Torres was running through his final pre-flight checks. At 45, Torres had logged over 12,000 flight hours and had been flying commercial routes for 15 years after his stint as an Air Force pilot. This morning's flight was routine in every way that mattered to him. Clear weather, light passenger load, and an experienced crew. The only unusual item on his checklist was a brief notation from air traffic control about increased military activity in the area. Not uncommon around Washington, D.C., but worth noting, Torres made a mental note to stay alert for any air traffic control instructions that might reroute them or change their approach to Reagan National. As the Boeing 737 lifted off from Denver at 8:15 a.m., none of the 180 passengers aboard had any idea that their flight had already appeared on radar screens in 3 separate military installations. The woman in 12F continued reading her portfolio, occasionally making notes in the margins with a blue pen. 300 miles to the east, at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was monitoring routine air traffic when an automated alert chimed softly at her workstation. The system had flagged Flight 1247 for enhanced monitoring, though the reason wasn't immediately clear from her screen. Santos pulled up the flight details. Standard commercial route, no weather issues, no reported mechanical problems. She called her supervisor over. Master Sergeant David Park had been monitoring airspace for 12 years and had seen every type of alert the system could generate. When he saw Santos's screen, his expression changed immediately. "Pull up the passenger manifest," Park ordered quietly. Santos's fingers flew across her keyboard. The passenger list appeared, all 180 names in alphabetical order. Park scanned the list once, then again more slowly. When he reached the name Chen, Elizabeth M., his face went pale. Santos, I need you to step away from your station for 5 minutes. Sergeant, I don't understand. 5 minutes. Go get coffee. When you come back, we never had this conversation. As Santos reluctantly left her post, Park reached for a secure phone line that connected directly to North American Aerospace Defense Command. The conversation was brief and conducted in codes that would mean nothing to anyone without proper clearance. When he hung up, Park deleted the alert from Santos's screen and created a new monitoring protocol that would track Flight 1247 without generating any automated notifications. Elizabeth Chen, though that wasn't the name most people would know her by, was supposed to be traveling by military transport. She was supposed to have a security detail. She was supposed to be in a secure facility, not reading classified intelligence reports on a commercial airline where anyone could see her. But Elizabeth Chen had built her career on being where she wasn't supposed to be. As one of the most senior intelligence analysts in the U.S. government, she had spent the last 25 years in positions so classified that her name appeared on no public government rosters. Her work had prevented 3 terrorist attacks, identified 2 foreign intelligence operations on American soil, and provided the intelligence that had led to the successful operations against several high-value international targets. She had also, 18 months ago, uncovered evidence that someone within the highest levels of the U.S. government was selling military secrets to foreign powers. The investigation had been so sensitive that only 5 people in the entire government knew about it. Elizabeth was one of them. The portfolio she was reading contained the final piece of evidence needed to identify the traitor. She had insisted on flying commercial because she suspected that someone with access to military flight schedules was monitoring her movements. Her decision to book a regular airline ticket under her birth name, a name that should have been buried in classified files, was a calculated risk designed to smoke out anyone who might be tracking her. Back on Flight 1247, passengers were settling in for the long flight to Washington. The businessman in 3A had fallen asleep over his presentation notes. The mother in 8C was successfully entertaining her twins with coloring books. The college student in 15B was listening to music with his eyes closed. Elizabeth continued reading, occasionally glancing out her window at the landscape passing 35,000 feet below. She appeared calm, but her training had taught her to stay alert, even in seemingly safe situations. When the flight attendant offered her a snack, Elizabeth accepted with a smile, but noted that the woman's hands were slightly shaky. When the passenger across the aisle asked to borrow her pen, Elizabeth politely declined and kept the pen in her jacket pocket. These weren't signs of paranoia. They were habits developed over decades of work in situations where a single mistake could cost lives. What Elizabeth didn't know was that her decision to fly commercial had already triggered the most extensive covert protection operation in the history of American aviation. What she also didn't know was that the name on her ticket had been flagged in every military database in the country, and that her presence on Flight 1247 was about to turn a routine morning flight into a 4-hour exercise in controlled tension that would test the limits of military protocol and national security procedures. As Captain Torres requested his cruising altitude from Denver Air Traffic Control, 2 F-22 Raptor fighter jets were being prepped for an unscheduled training exercise at Buckley Air Force Base. The pilots receiving the briefing were told they would be practicing long-range escort procedures. They weren't told what they would be escorting, or why the mission briefing was classified, at a level that required them to surrender their personal phones before entering the briefing room. They weren't told that their training exercise would involve shadowing a commercial airliner for 4 hours while staying far enough away to avoid detection by civilian radar. And they certainly weren't told that the success of their mission might determine whether one of the most important intelligence operations in recent history would succeed or fail catastrophically. Flight 1247 continued its eastward journey, its passengers unaware that they were flying in what had become the most carefully monitored airspace in the country. In seat 12F, Elizabeth Chen turned another page of her portfolio and made another note in the margin. In less than 4 hours, she would walk off this plane and into a meeting that could change the balance of power in Washington forever. But first, she had to get there safely. And as the morning progressed, that was becoming less and less certain. 2 hours into Flight 1247, Major Alex Rodriguez and Captain Jenny Park were maintaining their positions 15 miles behind and 2,000 feet above the commercial airliner. To any civilian observer, the two F-22 Raptors would be invisible, flying in a loose formation that kept them beyond visual range, while allowing their advanced radar systems to monitor every detail of the United flight's progress. Rodriguez had been flying F-22s for 8 years, but he'd never been given a mission quite like this one. The briefing had been unusually vague. Escort and protect commercial flight 1247 from Denver to Washington, D.C. Maintain concealment. Rules of engagement are classified. When he'd asked his commanding officer what they were protecting the flight from, the answer had been simple: everything. Captain Park, flying as his wingman, had even more questions. At 29, she was one of the youngest pilots ever to qualify for F-22 operations, and her analytical mind was working overtime trying to understand their mission parameters. She'd flown escort missions before, usually for high-value military transports or VIP flights, but those flights carried government officials or foreign dignitaries whose importance was obvious. Flight 1247 was just a regular United Airlines flight with regular passengers, or so she thought. Raptor 1, this is Control. The voice crackled through Rodriguez's headset. We're tracking weather system moving in from the west. Flight 1247 may request course deviation. Copy Control. We'll adjust accordingly. The weather system was minor, nothing that would normally cause problems for a commercial flight, but he'd been ordered to stay with Flight 1247 no matter what, which meant following any course changes or altitude adjustments the commercial pilots might make. Aboard Flight 1247, Captain Torres was indeed monitoring the approaching weather. The storm system was weak, but it would add some turbulence to their flight path. He made the decision to request a slight course correction that would take them around the worst of it. As he radioed air traffic control for permission to deviate 10 degrees south of their planned route, he had no idea that his request would require approval from military commanders he'd never heard of. In the cabin, Elizabeth Chen had noticed the slight change in engine tone that indicated they were adjusting course. Most passengers wouldn't have picked up on such a subtle change, but Elizabeth's training had taught her to notice everything. She glanced out her window and saw storm clouds building in the distance. A routine weather deviation, nothing more. She returned to her reading, though her concentration was being tested by the passenger in 11F, directly in front of her. He was a young man in his 20s who had been making phone calls almost constantly since takeoff. The calls seemed to be business-related. Something about shipping schedules and delivery confirmations. Nothing unusual about a businessman making calls during a flight. What was unusual was the pattern of his calls. Elizabeth had been half listening for over an hour, and she'd noticed that every call followed the same format. He would dial, speak for exactly 3 minutes, hang up, wait 5 minutes, then dial again. The precision was too perfect to be coincidental. Elizabeth had spent enough time in counterintelligence to recognize surveillance patterns when she saw them. The young man could be innocent. Maybe he had a compulsive personality, or was working from a very detailed checklist, but the timing was too regular, and his voice was too controlled for someone conducting routine business calls. She made a mental note to remember his face, and settled back in her seat, allowing her training to take over. One of the first rules of staying alive in dangerous situations was to trust your instincts. If something felt wrong, it probably was wrong. Meanwhile, the two F-22 pilots were dealing with complications of their own. The course deviation requested by Flight 1247 would take them into airspace that was scheduled for another military exercise. Rodriguez radioed for clarification and was told to hold position while the other exercise was moved to accommodate their training mission. "This is getting weird," Captain Park commented over their secure communication channel. "They're moving a whole squadron of F-16s just so we can follow one commercial flight?" Rodriguez had to agree. In his 8 years of flying military missions, he'd seen impressive resources devoted to protecting important targets. But the level of coordination surrounding Flight 1247 was beyond anything in his experience. When he'd departed Buckley Air Force Base 2 hours ago, he'd been told that at least 12 different air traffic control centers had been briefed on their mission. That level of coordination was usually reserved for presidential flights or operations involving imminent national security threats. Raptor 1, this is Control. We need you to tighten your formation and prepare for possible intercept procedures. Both pilots felt their adrenaline spike. Intercept procedures meant they might need to force another aircraft to land or change course. It meant that someone viewed as a threat was approaching Flight 1247. Control, this is Raptor 1. Please clarify threat assessment. Raptor 1, we have an unidentified aircraft approaching Flight 1247's flight path. Small aircraft, not responding to radio contact. Rodriguez and Park immediately began scanning their instruments and visual displays. Their F-22s were equipped with the most advanced radar and targeting systems in the world. If there was an unidentified aircraft in the area, they would find it. There it was. A small single-engine aircraft, probably a Cessna, flying at 12,000 feet and heading directly toward Flight 1247's position. The plane was flying without a filed flight plan and hadn't responded to repeated radio contacts from air traffic control. Under normal circumstances, this would be handled by civilian authorities or Air National Guard units. Small planes strayed into restricted airspace fairly regularly, usually due to pilot error or equipment problems. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Rodriguez had been ordered to treat any unknown aircraft as a potential threat. Raptor 2, this is Raptor 1. I'm moving to intercept. Maintain overwatch on the commercial flight. Copy, Raptor 1. Rodriguez pushed his F-22 into a steep dive, accelerating toward the small aircraft. As he closed the distance, he could see that it was indeed a Cessna 172, a common training and recreational aircraft. The plane appeared to be flying normally, with no obvious signs of distress or hostile intent. But appearances could be deceiving. A small aircraft loaded with explosives could do significant damage to a commercial airliner if it managed to get close enough. And if someone wanted to send a message by attacking a seemingly routine flight, using an innocent-looking private plane would be an effective method. Rodriguez positioned his F-22 alongside the Cessna, close enough that the civilian pilot couldn't miss seeing him. The effect was immediate. The small plane banked sharply to the left and began descending rapidly. Rodriguez could see the pilot frantically working his radio controls. Control, this is Raptor 1. Target aircraft is responding and moving away from Flight 1247's position. Appears to be civilian pilot who strayed into restricted airspace. Copy, Raptor 1. Continue monitoring until target aircraft is clear of the area. As Rodriguez watched the Cessna disappear toward the south, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The intercept had gone too smoothly. Civilian pilots who suddenly found themselves face-to-face with military fighters usually panicked. This pilot had reacted quickly and professionally, almost as if he'd been expecting to encounter military aircraft. Back aboard Flight 1247, none of the passengers had any idea how close they'd come to a potentially dangerous situation. Elizabeth Chen continued reading her portfolio, though she'd noticed that the young man in 11F had stopped making his regular phone calls about 20 minutes ago. She'd also noticed that he kept checking his watch, which showed obvious signs of anxiety. Flight attendant Sarah Chen was beginning to feel increasingly uneasy about the flight. As a senior crew member, she was trained to watch for signs of trouble among passengers. The young man in 11F was definitely agitated about something. He'd been checking his phone constantly, but now he seemed to be waiting for something. His leg was bouncing nervously, and he kept looking toward the front of the plane. More concerning was her growing certainty that the woman in 12F was not who she appeared to be. Sarah had worked thousands of flights, and she'd developed an ability to read passengers that was almost supernatural. Business travelers had a particular way of moving and speaking. Government employees had their own patterns. Military personnel, even in civilian clothes, carried themselves differently. The woman in 12F moved like someone with military training, but she also had the awareness and caution of someone in law enforcement or intelligence work. And the portfolio she was reading wasn't a normal business document. Sarah had glimpsed it when bringing refreshments, and the pages were covered with charts, photographs, and text layouts that looked more like intelligence reports than quarterly financial statements. Sarah made a decision that would later be credited with preventing a potential disaster. She approached the cockpit and requested permission to speak privately with Captain Torres. "Captain, I think we may have a situation developing in the cabin," she said quietly once the cockpit door was closed behind her. Torres looked up from his instruments. "What kind of situation?" "I have a passenger in 11F who's been acting increasingly nervous over the past hour, and I think the woman in 12F might be some kind of government official traveling without proper security." Torres considered this information carefully. As a former military pilot, he knew that government officials sometimes traveled on commercial flights when they wanted to maintain a low profile. But if Sarah was right about the woman in 12F being someone important, and if the man in 11F was planning some kind of action against her, they could be dealing with a serious security threat. "Keep monitoring both passengers," Torres instructed. "If the situation escalates, let me know immediately. I'll contact air traffic control and request priority handling for our approach to Reagan National." As Sarah returned to the cabin, she had no idea that Captain Torres's next radio call would trigger the largest coordinated security response in the history of commercial aviation. She also had no idea that the two F-22 fighters shadowing their flight had just been joined by 4 additional military aircraft, or that every air traffic control facility between their current position and Washington, D.C. had been placed on the highest alert status. The woman in 12F continued reading her portfolio, unaware that her presence on Flight 1247 had turned a routine Tuesday morning into a test of how well America's most secret security systems could respond to an unprecedented situation. In less than 2 hours, Flight 1247 would begin its approach to Reagan National Airport, and Elizabeth Chen would finally discover whether her gamble to smoke out a traitor had worked, or whether she had put 180 innocent people in danger for nothing. With 90 minutes remaining until landing at Reagan National, the tension aboard Flight 1247 was reaching a breaking point that only a few people fully understood. Major Rodriguez and Captain Park were now flying with 4 additional military aircraft in a protective formation that stretched across 15 miles of airspace. On the ground, every major security agency in the Washington, D.C. area had been quietly placed on high alert, but the most dangerous tension was building inside the cabin of Flight 1247 itself. The young man in seat 11F had been waiting for a specific phone call for the past hour. When it finally came, the conversation lasted exactly 30 seconds. Elizabeth Chen, sitting directly behind him, caught only fragments. "Confirmed approaching Washington, proceed as planned." "Understood." The call ended abruptly, and the man's entire demeanor changed. The nervous energy that had been building for hours transformed into cold determination. Elizabeth had been conducting psychological assessments for 25 years, and she recognized the shift immediately. Whatever the man in 11F was planning, it was about to happen. She quickly reviewed her options, which were limited by her position, the confined space of the aircraft cabin, and her need to avoid revealing her identity to the other passengers. Flight attendant Sarah Chen was approaching with the beverage cart when she noticed both passengers had become notably alert. The woman in 12F was no longer reading her portfolio, but was instead watching the man in 11F with focused attention. The man himself had opened his carry-on bag and was reaching inside for something. Sarah's training kicked in. She immediately activated the cabin crew alert system by pressing a discrete button on her belt that would signal the other flight attendants and the cockpit that there was a potential security situation in progress. The alert system was designed to work silently, without alarming passengers or alerting potential threats that they had been detected. In the cockpit, Captain Torres received the alert signal and immediately contacted air traffic control with a coded message that indicated possible criminal activity aboard his aircraft. The message was relayed instantly to the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Pentagon, where it landed on the desk of General Patricia Williams, who was coordinating the protection operation for Flight 1247. General Williams had been monitoring the flight for 3 hours, knowing only that a person of critical importance to national security was aboard the aircraft. When she received the security alert, she made a decision that had never been made before in the history of American aviation. She authorized the immediate boarding of Flight 1247 by federal agents while the aircraft was still in flight. The plan was extraordinary in its complexity and had never been attempted on a commercial flight. 2 military helicopters carrying FBI hostage rescue team members were already airborne and approaching Flight 1247's position. Using a technique that had been developed for military operations but never used on a civilian aircraft, the agents would fast rope from the helicopters onto the plane's wing and enter through emergency exits. But before the boarding operation could begin, the situation inside Flight 1247 escalated beyond anyone's expectations. The man in 11F stood up abruptly and moved toward the aisle, carrying what appeared to be a small electronic device. Elizabeth Chen recognized the device immediately. It was a portable electromagnetic pulse generator, capable of disabling the aircraft's electronic systems and forcing an emergency landing. But an EMP device used at 35,000 feet wouldn't just force a landing. It would almost certainly cause a crash that would kill everyone aboard. Elizabeth had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether 180 innocent people lived or died. Her cover would be blown, her mission would be compromised, and her 25 years of maintaining one of the most classified identities in American intelligence would be destroyed. But the alternative was unthinkable. She moved with a speed and precision that stunned everyone in her section of the cabin. In one fluid motion, she stood, grabbed the man's wrist as he reached toward the aircraft's electrical panel, and applied a joint lock that immediately rendered his hand immobile. The EMT device fell to the floor of the aircraft with a metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. "Federal agent," Elizabeth announced in a voice that carried throughout the cabin. Everyone remained seated and calm. The young man struggled briefly, but Elizabeth's training included advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques. Within seconds, she had him face down in the aisle with his arms secured behind his back. Flight attendant Sarah Chen, despite her shock at the sudden violence, immediately handed Elizabeth a pair of plastic restraints from the aircraft's emergency kit. "This is Captain Torres," came the announcement over the cabin speakers. "We have a security situation under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will be making an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport." But even as Elizabeth secured the would-be saboteur, she realized that the situation was far more complex than a single terrorist attempting to bring down an aircraft. The man's EMP device had been sophisticated, expensive, and specifically calibrated for the electronic systems used in Boeing's 737 aircraft. This wasn't a random attack. It was a targeted operation designed to eliminate her before she could deliver the intelligence that would expose the traitor in the U.S. government. The attack confirmed what Elizabeth had suspected for months. Someone with access to the highest levels of classified information knew about her investigation and was willing to kill nearly 200 people to stop her from completing it. Major Rodriguez, flying Overwatch in his F-22, received word that the threat aboard Flight 1247 had been neutralized, but his orders remained unchanged: escort the aircraft to a secure landing and maintain protection until all passengers had been safely evacuated and the high-value person aboard the flight had been secured. When he heard the name of the federal agent who had neutralized the threat, Rodriguez nearly broke formation in shock. Every military pilot with security clearance above a certain level knew that name, even though they were forbidden from speaking it aloud. Elizabeth Chen was a legend in intelligence circles, the analyst whose work had prevented more terrorist attacks and foreign intelligence operations than any single person in American history. "Control, this is Raptor 1, Rodriguez radioed. "Request confirmation of previous transmission." Raptor 1, transmission confirmed. High-value asset is Agent Elizabeth Chen. Priority Alpha protection status. Captain Park, flying alongside Rodriguez, heard the exchange and felt her understanding of their mission shift completely. They weren't just escorting a commercial flight. They were protecting one of the most important intelligence assets in the country. the woman whose analysis had helped prevent the bombing of the Super Bowl 3 years earlier. The woman whose investigation had exposed the foreign spy ring operating inside the Department of Defense. The woman whose work was so classified that most people in the intelligence community knew her only as the analyst. Flight 1247 was diverted to Andrews Air Force Base, where the longest runway on the East Coast would allow for a safe emergency landing. As the aircraft began its descent, Elizabeth Chen found herself in the unusual position of having to provide comfort to passengers who were terrified by the violent confrontation they had witnessed. "The situation is under control," she assured the mother with twins in seat 8C. "This man was planning to damage the aircraft systems, but that's not going to happen now." To the businessman in 3A, who was clearly shaken by seeing what he'd assumed was a normal businesswoman suddenly transform into a federal agent, she offered a different kind of reassurance. "I know this is frightening, but you're safe. We're all safe." What Elizabeth couldn't tell the passengers was that their flight had been under military protection for the entire journey, or that their emergency landing was being coordinated by some of the highest-ranking officials in the U.S. government. She couldn't explain that the man who had tried to sabotage their aircraft was part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government, or that his capture represented a breakthrough in one of the most important counterintelligence operations in decades. As Flight 1247 touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, it was met by what appeared to be a small army of federal agents, military personnel, and emergency responders. The passengers were evacuated quickly and efficiently, with each person being briefly interviewed and then transported to a secure facility for more detailed questioning. Elizabeth Chen was the last person to leave the aircraft. As she walked down the jetway, she was met by Director James Harrison of the FBI, General Patricia Williams, and Deputy Director of National Intelligence Rebecca Moore, 3 of the 5 people who knew about her investigation into the government mole. "The portfolio?" Director Harrison asked quietly. Elizabeth handed him the black case that had seemed like routine business reading to her fellow passengers. "Everything you need to identify and prosecute the traitor. The man who tried to sabotage the aircraft was hired by someone with access to my travel plans and mission details. His phone records will lead you to the rest of the conspiracy." General Williams shook her head in amazement. "You turned a routine flight into a counterintelligence operation." "I turned a routine flight into the final chapter of a 2-year investigation," Elizabeth corrected. "Someone has been selling military secrets to foreign powers for at least 18 months. Today we proved who has access to information about my whereabouts and activities. The attack on Flight 1247 was their mistake. It gives us everything we need to expose them." 3 days later, the arrest of Deputy Secretary of Defense Michael Chambers would make headlines across the country. Chambers had been selling classified military intelligence to foreign governments for 2 years, earning over $3 million for information that had compromised American operations around the world. His downfall began when he learned that Elizabeth Chen was flying commercial from Denver to Washington to deliver evidence that would expose his activities. His decision to hire a saboteur to bring down Flight 1247 had seemed like the perfect solution. Eliminate the evidence and the investigator in what would appear to be a tragic aircraft accident. Instead, it became the final piece of evidence needed to prove his guilt. The saboteur's phone records led directly to intermediaries who led directly to Chambers. The money trail was clear, the communications were documented, and the case was airtight. The passengers of Flight 1247 never learned the full truth about their emergency landing. They were told that federal agents had thwarted a terrorist attack, which was true as far as it went. They never learned that the quiet businesswoman in seat 12F was one of the most important intelligence analysts in the country, or that their 4-hour flight had been protected by 6 military aircraft and coordinated by the highest levels of American national security. Elizabeth Chen returned to her classified work, her identity once again buried in files that few people had clearance to access. But for 4 hours on a Tuesday morning, she had been just another passenger on Flight 1247, reading what appeared to be routine business documents while sitting in seat 12F. The difference was that her routine business documents contained evidence that would reshape American national security, and her presence on that flight had turned an ordinary commercial airline route into the most protected airspace in the country. Flight attendant Sarah Chen would later receive a commendation for her alertness and professionalism during the crisis. She never learned the true identity of the woman in 12F, but she would never forget the moment when an apparently ordinary passenger transformed into a federal agent and saved everyone aboard Flight 1247. Major Rodriguez and Captain Park would both receive classified medals for their role in protecting the flight, though the citations would never mention the specific nature of their mission or the identity of the person they had been protecting. And somewhere in the classified files of American intelligence, the case of Flight 1247 would be recorded as one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in recent history. The day when a routine commercial flight became the stage for exposing a traitor and protecting one of America's most valuable intelligence assets. The woman in seat 12F had completed her mission. The traitor had been exposed. The conspiracy had been unraveled. And 179 innocent passengers had gone home safely to their families, never knowing how close they had come to becoming casualties in a secret war fought at 35,000 feet.